Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay is a historian of the presidency, political culture, and the government, especially the cabinet. She has a PhD in history from the University of California, Davis. She has been a professor. She has also been a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. She's been a fellow at the Klug Center of Library of Congress and many other places. She is the author of the book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. And she has recently co-edited the book, Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture with Matthew Costello. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We noted in the conversation, initially this was supposed to be a conversation with both Lindsay and Matt, but Matt had some technical difficulties and some internet issues and glitches, and so we were really sad that he couldn't make it for the conversation. And so hopefully he can come on at some other point and talk about some of all the other work that he's doing. We start the conversation by talking about how the book came about. So obviously it's an edited book. I know Matt has one essay he wrote in there, and Lindsay, I think, wrote the introduction. I think that's right. And so they obviously edited all the other chapters. There are 12 presidents that are covered. And they talked about how certain papers or essays were chosen, what their kind of themes were, and how this topic of how the public mourns U.S. presidents, how we've done that in our history, how funerals occur, for presidents, etc. Some of the themes they cover are of race, political party, and family. This is kind of these through lines through all of the funerals and some of the presidents they cover in the book. We talk about how the United States compares with other countries and how they mourn or have funerals for heads of state. We talk about this idea of legacy and why we think about legacy so shortly after a president has passed or a former president has passed. And then we get into some of the specific presidents. We don't cover all of them, but we cover many of them, actually. We talk about, obviously, George Washington, who's kind of the first, so he kind of sets the tone for many things. His funeral was very private in one sense, but many people obviously, lauded him as a great president, great person. We talk about Jefferson and some of his descendants. As I say in the conversation, it's one of the best, I think, chapters in the book. We talk about President Taylor and his mixed legacy, what his legacy was as a general, but then what his legacy was as a president. It's fairly mixed. We talk about the global impact of Abraham Lincoln's death. We talk about Teddy Roosevelt and seeing him through sort of a current lens and how we continue to understand things about Roosevelt as we move through history. We talk about the generational impact of FDR. We talk about the widespread impact for various generations and communities for JFK's assassination and his death. We talk about the long goodbye of Reagan. Obviously, he had a very long post-presidency dealing with Alzheimer's. And then we talk about some of the bipartisanship that was occurring more recently with the most recent loss of George H.W. Bush, and just kind of what the future looks like for how we mourn presidents, how we think about them, how we talk about legacy. So it's very, very interesting to see how this kind of develops. I have to say, obviously, Lindsay's been on before. She's always wonderful. She has such a wonderful way of explaining things about U.S. history. It's always very fresh, and she's quite brilliant. And so I always enjoy speaking with her. I'm excited for much of the work that she's working on and some stuff that she has coming out. Same goes for Matt, although he couldn't be on the conversation. Excited for some of the work he's doing as well. So it's all wonderful stuff. Again, the book is called Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. You can get that everywhere. And as always, you can listen to this conversation and all other conversations. It's my Substack, which is convergentdialogues.substack.com. Head over there, subscribe. You can listen to this conversation, all the other ones I've had, and all the ones I will have. And so now I bring you Lindsay Chervinsky. I'm here with Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to talk with you about a book that you have just put out, that you've co-edited with Matthew Costello. The book is Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. Before we get into it, just give us the brief snapshot of yourself and what you've worked on, what you're currently working on, and how you came about doing the book.
Sure. So I am a presidential historian. My first book was called The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. I am the co-editor of this volume, Mourning the Presidents, with Matthew Costello, who unfortunately very much wanted to join us, and a internet downage, windstorm, catastrophe in the age of Zoom prevented that. So I will try and carry the ship. I am currently working on a book on John Adams and his presidency. And when I am not doing history and writing, I am usually hiking with my dog, John Quincy Dog Adams.
Yeah, that's all very wonderful. And you're obviously very busy. And so how did you guys kind of get this project going, and how did you, decide who does what? So there's a collection of essays in here. How is there 15? How many essays are in here? 10, 15?
So there are 12 presidents and an introduction and a preface and a conclusion. So, I'm a historian, not a mathematician for a reason, but there's a 12
lot. 12 presidents.
So the inspiration for this work came when George H.W. Bush died in 2018. And we noticed that there was this incredible bipartisan outpouring of support and remembrances and commemoration of his legacy. And while I think he was really an underappreciated president, some of the pieces that were written about him and some of the things people were saying were from people who I wouldn't necessarily have expected to be so sort of uniformly positive. And what we noticed is that the things that they were saying about Bush, that he was kind and decent and humble and had a sense of humor, seemed almost more a reflection of what was missing from our current politics and a testament to a different time when politics seemed a little bit more gentle, or at least a little bit more genteel. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, these reflections were more about the American people at the moment than they were necessarily about Bush. And so we started thinking about, is this the only time this has happened? Or have there been other moments when presidents have died and something happens and the American people choose to remember that person in a way that says an awful lot about them in that moment? And so we decided to put together a volume to explore this concept from Washington to Bush, since no one has really studied the subject on that sort of chronological scope. Certainly, Nixon and Kennedy and individuals have had their legacies examined, but not in this sort of way. And we knew that there were some that we had to hit. So you have to have a Washington to sort of kick things off. You have to have Lincoln. You have to have Kennedy. You have to have Bush, because he was what inspired it. Mm. And then we put out a call for papers on all the sites that historians frequent, and asked if people had any innovative or interesting ideas, because we really did want to balance those big names with some lesser known ones and sort of see if anyone came up with some innovative approaches. And so then we pieced together a combination of invitations and sort of select approaches with proposals that people had put forward, trying to make sure we had chronological balance, wanted to balance the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as different approaches and maybe ways to study individuals, as well as different representation for different parts of the history field. So we wanted to make sure public historians and people who worked at presidential libraries were also represented.
Yeah. It does seem very balanced, and I do want to ask about the presidents that are listed, but I guess before we get to that, you mentioned, I think it's an introduction about these themes that are covered in the book of race, political party, and family, which were emphasized in the volume. Was that something that you wanted to do from the beginning, and then as you had the papers come in, you started to see which fit that, or did that come about as you were getting papers and saying, well, we're seeing these themes kind of pop up? How did that kind of, I guess, come about?
It's a great question. We knew there were some things we wanted to hit. So, for example, it was really important to us with some of the earlier presidents, especially, that we weren't just rehashing the old story of mourning. So, for example, the Jefferson chapter is written by Andrew Davenport, who is a historian at Monticello, but is also a descendant in the Hemmings line. And so we really wanted to make sure that we told the story about what happened to the African-American people who were enslaved at Monticello after Jefferson died. And so there were a couple of examples where we knew that race needed to play a part of the story because it hadn't really been focused or emphasized on in previous works that had studied this person. And we knew there were people who, like Jackson, had a really huge surge of popularity at various points, but his legacy was really kind of, suffering over time, or, had enjoyed a little bit of a revision over time. And we thought that would be interesting and useful to explore. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that we included all of the people that were involved in the creation of a legacy. So understood that, of course, families and first ladies were going to play a role in this part of the story. And we didn't necessarily know what role. So a lot of this was just kind of waiting and seeing how the chapters played out. But we did encourage the contributors to think in that way so that we would have a more fulsome approach to how these things were crafted, and not just the one white guy dies and then, boom, he's mourned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously, I think anyone that's reading it is going to think about the times in their life where they've gone to a funeral or they've mourned someone or something like that. And so I guess, obviously, with public figures, it's a little bit different. We don't meet these people. They obviously serve a role. It's the highest office, if you will, in the land, or one of the highest. But so it's a little bit different. I guess, how does the themes of death and mourning of a president usually kind of rest for Americans? Is it something where, as you were mentioning, if someone has a good post-presidency, we're going to look at it more favorably, kind of like with H.W. Bush, of like, well, you know what? He was a nice guy. He was gentle. He was a good dad. He's been a centerpiece of American politics for the last, 50 years, et cetera. Or is it more just kind of like, well, this is a former president that has now died, and now there's like, is it kind of person dependent, or is it just the fact that a president dies? How do we usually, as an American public, kind of have a treatment of sorts of when they pass?
I do think it is person dependent. So there are a couple of examples that kind of demonstrate the different ends of the spectrum, for example, for presidents that both had long lives post-presidency, but kind of experienced a different reception. So Bush is a great example, where he had a long career of public service, and then he was president, and then he was alive for a long time. And he and his family were able to play pretty active roles in shaping what his funeral procession would look like, what those rituals would be, what his presidential library would look like. Although he famously apparently banned the use of the word legacy around him, because he said it wasn't up for him to decide. Like he could decide what he wanted the library to emphasize and to focus on, but it was for others to determine what that legacy should be, which I think is pretty funny. Mm-hmm. But on the flip side of that is Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover also had an extraordinarily long public service career. He then was president. He left office sort of not in disgrace, but in a dark cloud because of the Great Depression and the sense by the American public that he hadn't done anything about it. And then he spent the rest of his life really trying to reshape what that legacy was. And to be fair to him, his resistance to taking federal action during the Great Depression was deeply based on ideology. He believed that the market would right itself and it would take care of itself, and the government was not supposed to act. And so much of his post-presidential life was really focused on that ideology, creating or helping form scholarly centers that focused on what we would think of today sort of as true traditional small c conservative ideology, not really the conservative party today, but what sort of small c conservatism would have been in the 1940s, promoting scholarship and other ideas, helping presidents who shared similar passions and similar approaches to the world. He was an advisor to a bunch of different presidents and vice presidents. And he was really trying to craft a legacy such that people wouldn't remember him just for the presidency. And it didn't really work so well. So, it's still really what we remember. And so I think those are two examples that show that it does depend on the person. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on when they die and where they die and how they die and what they leave behind and what the country is also going through at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that sounds right, because you can think about how, we receive people. And of course, a person's legacy does shape over time, and it evolves and changes. It can change for the good or for worse. It depends on the person and the time that you're in. It's interesting. I guess one thing I was thinking about when I was reading the book was, we're obviously a young country in terms of being a recognized independent state. How we've, again, there's an evolution of this, right? You mentioned, Washington as the first, and then how we've had people since then. And it kind of gets a little bit more, I guess you could say, grand, or there's more to do about it than it is with Washington, which seemed more private. But how do we compare, I guess, with other countries in the world that do this? Obviously that have longer histories or have had, dynasties or things like that. But I guess for other, if you will, kind of westernized countries, how do we kind of compare, I guess, with our process of how we do things now? Again, the most recent is H.W. Bush. People can kind of remember what that was like and what we did, and being at a particular church, and then the procession, and then laying in state, and all these things. I guess, how do we compare globally with other countries?
It's a great question. I think that there are some similarities that might surprise people. So for those who watched the relatively recent funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, you might notice some pretty stark similarities between that funeral for a monarch and the more recent presidential funerals we've had, which are these sort of grand state processions, and they lie in state, and they're several days, and they're across the country, and it's a really big deal. That's a little bit of a bizarre thing to say, given that we're supposed to be a republic, and sort of the founding ideology of our nation was in rebellion against monarchy. And in theory, every citizen is the same as the next. And after a president leaves office, they're supposed to go back to being a citizen. So that's sort of a bizarre parallel to draw. And I think that for most other Western countries, so for example, in Great Britain, if a prime minister dies, with a couple of exceptions, usually the response is not the same. Now, Winston Churchill had a pretty enormous sort of response to his death, but again, that's kind of an exception. My understanding is that, for example, like in Canada or in Finland or Sweden, if one of their prime ministers or their heads of state dies, I don't think there is uniformly that same reception. I'm not an expert, of course, on Swedish history, but that's my sense. Now, what will be interesting to see is some presidents have felt quite strongly that this sort of state funeral is inappropriate and have really pushed back on those norms. So Truman was an example. He felt that he was supposed to just be an average person, and a small, funeral was appropriate. My understanding also is that Carter has requested the same. He has requested not having a state funeral. So that will be really, I think, a challenge for us to think about what is the right role for these things when people are no longer in office. And in a lot of ways, the celebrations are not necessarily about the person, but about the office. And is that appropriate?
Yeah. I was actually wondering about Carter, because obviously he's the oldest living or former president. And I think he's 99 this year. Is that right? That sounds right. Or 98, 99. It's somewhere over there. It's almost 100. And I was wondering about that.
Extraordinary life.
Yeah. It's super long after being president. It's been 43 years now. So since he finished. So it's remarkable, and he's a great humanitarian, all these things. But I was wondering about that. If I'm sure he has all of this planned out and laid out, and that doesn't surprise me. Just knowing enough about him to know the various things I read, that he's a very genuinely, I think, kind of humble person, and wants things very simple and low key, and that doesn't surprise me. So it does sound like there is some variability here based on the person. If they say, "Hey, look, I don't want this," or some people may say, "Yeah, let's go for it," or whatever. So it's very interesting, the differences that come out there. I guess the one thing, kind of along with this, before we talk about some of the specific presidents, is this idea of legacy. So this happens. I think this happens in general when people will pass, but I think it's probably happened with some presidents. Is sometimes people want to do immediately this. Well, yeah, they're gone, but they were a pretty terrible person, or their administration sucked and it wasn't very good, and people will very quickly want to point out this negative approach to who they are. I mean, they may have been, gone, hours since it was reported, so and so has died, and all of a sudden there's all these hit pieces on the person's legacy, or they're terrible anyways, or they weren't really the best person, or all these things. And I can't recall. Nixon died in 94, right? So I can't remember what the immediacy of that was, but or other folks. But I guess it's one of those things where when we talk about legacy, Is there a certain amount of space that we should hold, right? Where it's like, look, you like him, you don't like him, but should we wait before we start, pulling out all of the opinion pieces about their life and all these things, because they are still a person, they do have family, they have all these things. How do we? I don't know. Maybe there's not a right answer for this, but I guess is there a type of ethic around here of like, maybe we just wait a week, or let's wait till the funeral's done, and then we can start trashing this person's life and what their administration was like. How do we, I guess, think generally about legacy, and then kind of time frame of it?
It's a really good question, and I don't think that there is any one right answer, or that everyone will necessarily have the same opinion, because I've also had the inverse reaction where someone dies and they were a real jerk face, and everyone says nothing but good things about them, and I'm like, that's a lie.
Right.
And it drives me crazy, because it just feels so dishonest, and it feels insincere and not genuine. But I totally take your point, and there have been times where someone has died, and I have also been frustrated by the let's give it a minute. Let's take a beat. Yeah. So I don't know exactly what the right balance is. I do think, however, we should acknowledge and hold space for a difference between reflection and legacy, because those are different things. We can have reflections that, if you want to only share good reflections, or if you want to share your experiences or your thoughts or how you felt about a person, that is totally appropriate in the immediate aftermath of a death or a funeral or a ceremony. And of course, giving space that not everyone's reflections would necessarily be the same. But legacy is, I think, much more complicated, and is perhaps a little bit more analytical, and should take into a broader view the good, bad, and ugly, and sort of take the whole man approach, if you will, or whole woman approach when appropriate. And that should, I think, include the good and the bad, and thinking about, how we should make sense of the fact that every person, of course, has good and bad. And so to me, legacy is a little bit more like history, a little bit more like analysis, a little bit more like scholarship, whereas, reflection is going to be biased and shaped by the fact that someone has just died.
Yeah, I think that distinction is very accurate, and I think right to do. I guess, I mean, you're the historian here. Is there still the kind of unwritten rule that you can't really judge someone's legacy, let's say, at least of their administration, to at least a generation or two? So we're talking 30 to 50-ish years before you can really have, because, now we're getting all the Carter stuff, right? And, he's still alive, which, it's quite interesting, but we're getting the Carter stuff. I know people have written about Reagan, but I guess maybe we're getting to that point where we can be a little bit more, I don't want to say objective, but that you can kind of see a broader view of it now that we've seen impact of sorts. Is that, when we think about legacy, is that still kind of the same way? It's like, well, just because someone is gone or they've died, that doesn't mean we should do that, because things, as we see their implications of their administration's, achievements or not, we have to wait to see what the impact of that is. And so is that still kind of the same thing in terms of legacy for historians, where they want to say, let's wait. We're not going to talk about Clinton. We're not going to talk about, Bush 43 just yet. We still got to wait maybe another decade and a half or something.
Well, there's definitely always pressure to have those conversations right away and to have them sooner rather than later. And there's always pressure to sort of put out the first history and the first round of history. I really push back against that, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, for myself at least, when I am living through a moment, I am nowhere near objective. Now, I don't think that humans can ever be purely objective because we're humans, but we can get closer and we can be a little bit more aware of our blind spots. So, for example, I do write some think pieces, but I'm not going to write a biography or a true history of the previous administration because I'm not in a mental space where I can assess honestly and fairly. And that's because we've just lived through it. And so our feelings are still really wrapped up in what we're seeing and what we're thinking. And we can't really take evidence at face value. At least I can't. I think similarly, as passions cool over time, we're able to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff to see what actually really does rise above and what is really important and what maybe was just background noise or what were small sort of things that in the moment maybe seemed outrageous, but in the long term didn't have that sort of impact. And this goes to your point about like seeing how things develop. Sometimes we don't know what the true implications or ramifications are of something until we've had some distance in space. And the last piece, and this is something that I think a lot of people forget, a lot of presidential records are classified for decades. And rightly so, because, I mean, there's, of course, we've talked a lot and we've heard a lot about classification in the last couple of months, but there are things that need to stay secret for a while in order to protect source material and methods, especially with intelligence and foreign policy. And so a great example of this is Dwight Eisenhower. When Dwight Eisenhower left the presidency, he sort of had the reputation of being old and doddery and not really paying attention and wasn't all that involved. And so his reputation was fairly low. And then over time, as records became declassified, it became very apparent that he was actually acutely aware of everything that was going on. And that was a mask he put on for political and foreign policy reasons. But until we had all of that information, you can't accurately assess the role of an individual in administration. And so we don't have, most of the records from George W. Bush or President Obama. We are starting to get some of the older ones, but that takes time. And I think that that's appropriate and right. And so people can certainly write sort of like a first reaction to an administration, but you're not going to get everything until all those materials are available.
Yeah, that's another really good point, I think, because you're working kind of with your, one hand tied behind your back of sorts as a researcher or historian. It's like, well, we don't have all the stuff. It is interesting, though, about H.W. Bush, because granted, I think we're still about 30 plus years from when he was in office. But I think over time, people have seen him definitely more moderate than Reagan and definitely I think I forget which book it was. Maybe it was the Meacham book, but that he gets a little bit more credit for SALT II than he previously did before. And a lot of people gave that to Reagan, but it was, really him, you just, as we move away from it, we start to see like, people thought of Clinton extremely favorably, and less so. I don't know if that's less about his administration or more about some of the personal issues, but either way, there's an evolving, there's a changing, and to the point of we need to see where all this kind of stuff comes out in the wash, and then say, okay, now we've really done the ups and the downs, and then say, how can we look at this? So it is interesting seeing stuff come out on Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson. Johnson has had a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I don't want to, generally historians are terrible future predictors. So take this with the bucket of salt that it should be taken with. But one of the really interesting ways to map sort of new history and how people are reflecting on a president and their legacy is to track where they fall in the C-SPAN presidential rankings. And one of the ones that I think is so interesting is seeing Kennedy start to tick down over time and to see Lyndon Johnson start to tick up. And if there's ever a point where, they cross and LBJ comes out higher than Kennedy does, it wouldn't surprise me if at some point that happened. And I think that is really fascinating. And I would encourage people, listeners, and people who read the book, they will see that this concept of revisiting and reflection and rethinking how we want to remember someone is as old as humankind itself. That's just how things have always been. And so, revising history is not a new phenomenon. It's really just revisiting and asking new questions about, how we want to think about someone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk about a few presidents here. So let's start with Washington. He's the first, obviously. You got to talk about him. A few things about Washington. So
I do.
So he was a pretty, as far as we know, he's a pretty deeply private guy. Doesn't seem like he had all the fanfare. Again, he was the first. How much was this just kind of for him? I mean, reading the book, it seemed this way, but was it just for him? Like, this is just a funeral. This is just for me. He had it organized, but really kind of, it seemed close with his family and stuff. Did he not think of it like, oh, as the first president, I should set a precedent for all future presidents? Or we just don't know that? What is it in terms of kind of being the first and setting the stage, I guess, for even this bit of, when you're gone, what should happen, stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with Washington, one of the challenges is he very rarely wrote down why he did something, which is so frustrating. So the best we can do is sort of informed speculation about how he made these choices. We do know that he was keenly aware that everything he did was going to establish precedent. And he was also pretty meticulous about trying to make sure that he established a precedent for a civilian Republican, and this is little r Republican president. And so he was both a deeply private man, and he was sort of uncomfortable with a certain amount of fuss. But also, I think that the decision to request a private family personal ceremony was to suggest that that was the appropriate thing for a former president to do, that a former president shouldn't be celebrated with the sort of fanfare that accompanied a monarch's funeral. Now, I should point out that he didn't really get his way. So it wasn't the case that hundreds of thousands of people came to his ceremony because, of course, technology didn't really permit that sort of transportation at the time. However, right away, people started sort of inserting their preferences over his. So militia groups, the Freemasons in Alexandria, neighbors, friends came from out of town to make the ceremony at Mount Vernon much larger and with more fuss than he anticipated. And then the country staged over 400 mock funerals so that citizens could attend some sort of service, which sounds kind of weird to us that you would have an empty casket and people would show up and mourn, but that was how people expressed and expelled their grief in a way that made sense to them, including there was a casket with a portrait of him and a military sword in the chambers of the House of Representatives in Congress in Philadelphia to commemorate this mourning process. So it was national and much more, I think, fanfare than he would have anticipated. It just wasn't a one national day of mourning like we would see with Reagan or George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, it's very interesting how he kind of how things were and how he didn't want all of this, kind of big to do. But I mean, going back to the question about the personal aspect. I mean, he was quite revered as during his time. I mean, people saw him as like this. He's the general. He's wins the Revolutionary War. He's the first president. Granted, he has his criticisms at the time, but it seemed like it was a huge loss. And again, I think also at the time he lived quite 66, right? 66, 67.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he wasn't old for the time,
right?
But he was Yeah, he outlived all the male family members in the Washington family. They typically died quite young. And you're right. I mean, before he even became president, people were calling him the father of the country, which is pretty remarkable. And you're right. I think that it's hard for us to kind of put ourselves in this position because even though our country is still relatively young, it is now has survived for a couple hundred years. But Americans genuinely felt like they were sort of losing their anchor. He was such a symbolic force and such a presence, a stabilizing presence, that as long as he was around, the nation would be okay. That without that, there was, I think, a real sense of what would happen next. And there are a couple of other moments when I think that has happened, maybe with Lincoln a little bit, certainly with FDR, because he was president for such a long time that for a whole generation of young adults, they had literally not known another president. But it's a relatively rare phenomenon that someone plays that sort of role and carries that sort of weight in the American imagination.
Yeah, it is hard for us to kind of, like, FDR is probably the last person, maybe a little bit of Kennedy of sorts of how much he was loved, mostly by a lot of people. But so the chapter on Jefferson, which we mentioned in the beginning, was really, I think, one of the best. It was a really, really nice chapter. I liked the perspective. It was really, really good. But before I ask you about Jefferson, it's not in the book, but interesting is, again, I know you're fond of Adams. So Adams and Jefferson died on the same day, correct? July 4th, 1820.
50 years to the date after the Declaration of Independence, which people say history does not have a sense of fate or a sense of humor, and they are very wrong because you could not script this any better.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I guess for just briefly, I mean, Adams and Jefferson, I mean, they had different types of funerals as well. No, I mean, Adams also, it was different. I mean, even though they died on the same day, was different outcomes. No.
Yes and no. So neither of them had a national reflection like Washington. Both were much more localized, although there was certainly observations on a national scale about, oh my gosh, these two sort of lions in these two greats in American history have died on the same day and on this anniversary. And what does that mean for the nation's future? And that's kind of crazy. And so there are certainly people talking about it. But I think that, and locally, so Massachusetts, when John Adams died, some of the local militias groups came out, students came out to give orations, people came to the Adams home to pay respects and sort of marched by. Same in Charlottesville. What is, I think, similar about both is that they were relatively local, they were relatively family-based, they were a little bit more private. I think what is different is that Jefferson was still sort of revered as this huge political figure and the father of the political party that was really dominating at that moment, whereas Adams had more sort of petered out his political role. So I think that's where the difference comes.
Well, I guess with Jefferson, I mean, obviously the book centers on his, really troubled relationship and history with slavery and owning slaves. And I guess there was some element of this at the time, maybe less so, because it was not as we don't see it as we do today. I guess over time there's been, how do we examine Jefferson knowing this, and the chapter is a really interesting perspective. I mean, how do we think about this in terms of after he's gone, what happens with many of his affairs and also with the him being a slaveholder and things like that?
Yeah. So when Jefferson died, he was in tremendous debt. He was sort of beyond bankrupt, and the only way for his debts to be paid and met were to auction off the enslaved individuals he owned and to sell off his house. Otherwise, his children would be saddled with that debt, or his white children, I should say. So accordingly, not long after when his funeral happened, there were, of course, white attendees who were there from the local area and his family and his friends, and they were grief-stricken at the loss of this central figure in their lives. But there were also Black attendees, some of whom were related to Jefferson, who recognized the turning point that would happen because they had very little say over what would come next. Now, some of the individuals that Jefferson owned, especially if they were related to the Hemmings family, had the opportunity in quotes, because this is really the barest of minimums in this circumstance, but had the opportunity to sort of select who would purchase them if they had a family connection to a local person. If a local individual owned one of their children, they could maybe try and retain those family ties. And so they were able to stay in the Virginia area. However, most of the individuals were auctioned off and were sold to the Deep South to work in the burgeoning cotton empire. And as a result, they were torn apart from their family and loved ones. And for generations and centuries, and still to this day, a lot of people are not able to trace their lineage because of these types of sales. What was really important for us in telling this story is that so often the mourning process around Jefferson's death and what he left behind doesn't include this part of the story, or at least not until very recently, and will often completely erase the presence of African Americans even at the funeral or at the celebrations and the memorials later in that week. And so it was so important for us. And we invited Andrew Davenport, who is the author of this chapter and the historian at Monticello, and also a Hemmings descendant himself, to tell this story. And I think he does so with remarkable care. And it's very, it's analytical, it's scholarly, but it's also very personal.
Yeah, it's again, like I said, it was one of my favorite chapters in the book. So another mixed response of sorts for someone is Zachary Taylor, who some listeners may not know that he was a president. He's the 12th president of the United States. And I mean, really I was surprised to see it in the book, which was nice. I think I've read 2 books on Taylor. There's not a lot written on him. He's at least for the general public, he's usually seen as a great general, and not so good as president. I guess the question there is, I didn't know this. He doesn't have a presidential library and a memorial and a historic site. I didn't know that. Is this one of those things where it was like, even at the time and then subsequently, because obviously we have the Civil War after that and Reformation, things like that, Reconstruction. Is it one of those things where people are like, yeah, we don't really, he wasn't one of our best and brightest as president, so we're just not going to do any legacy kind of stuff even after he's gone. So just talk about why he was here and how maybe this is one of those situations where maybe the legacy piece doesn't have us memorializing him in the way we would with other people.
So one of the things about Taylor that I think is the best contribution of this chapter is almost immediately people have basically the same response that you did, kind of like, meh. Like that was a very mediocre president. And partly it's because he wasn't in office for very long, but the time that he was in office was so unremarkable because of the main crisis at the moment was Congress was trying to figure out what to do with all of the new territory that the U.S. had acquired in the Mexican-American War, and trying to figure out how do you deal with the slavery question in this new territory. And Taylor was unwilling to participate in a solution, and himself reflected the conflicting loyalties because he himself was a slave owner, but was a Northerner, and it was just very confusing. And so when he died, people just kind of decided that they were going to ignore the presidency because there wasn't anything remarkable there. And instead, we're going to focus on his military heroism, as you noted. And that is a great example of the American people remember what they want to remember and what is useful to them. And it was useful to them to have this moment of glory, a more unifying moment to focus on, rather than saying, we're still in this crisis and he did nothing to help us. And so I think that in that sense, the immediate reaction to him is very instructive and illustrative about what the country was going through. And you're right. I think right away, There was some commemoration in terms of material culture. There were items that were produced if people wanted to participate, but they all focused on his military career as opposed to his presidency. And there was no effort like there was later with, Theodore Roosevelt, who didn't necessarily have a place associated with him, but there was an effort to try and sort of create one or many. There wasn't that effort with Taylor, but there also wasn't that effort with a lot of the presidents kind of in that squishy period in the late 1840s and 1850s when we had a run of really subpar presidents. There have been a couple of times in American history where we've had some real duds, and that decade in particular was pretty full of duds.
Yeah, because you get Fillmore and Pierce and Buchanan. I mean, it's just
terrible.
Yeah, it's not our best decade for sure.
No, it's not.
Office.
I mean, to be fair to them, there was really, by that point, the 1850s were so dominated by the slavery question, and I think, while I never want to argue that civil war was inevitable, I think by the 1850s, there probably was no congressional compromise to solve that problem. So what really could they do to fix things? But at least in Buchanan's sense, he actively did not try. So they're not great.
No,
they're not great.
They're not great as presidents and maybe as men. But it's interesting because that's
as humans,
it was a time, and this kind of went throughout the rest of the 19th century, which is a lot of times generals were still seen as like a big deal for the American public, right? Less so than maybe presidents, I don't know. And hasn't really been until after, I would say, probably Eisenhower, I guess. After him, we don't, generals becoming president isn't a thing as much anymore. And it's, it has kind of shifted a little bit where, you have people like, Taylor and, a lot of people fought in wars. You have Grant, Garfield, I believe.
We've definitely had stretches where there are these periods of time in American history after the Revolution, after the Civil War, after World War I, World War II, after the Mexican-American War. You name it, where there are generations where it's almost a prerequisite to have served in the military in the conflict in order to be president, or at least to be in high politics. But you're right that after Eisenhower, we haven't had anyone really at high command. And I think that's sort of for two reasons. There is an increasing push to have the military be non-political, rightly so. I think the politicization of the military is incredibly dangerous. And second, politics has become, in two ways, our party structure is so much more rigid than it was. So the reason Taylor was drafted, both parties tried to kind of draft him, and same with Eisenhower. And it's because there was some flexibility in that party system, which does not exist right now. But also, politics is considered almost a lifelong profession. So you don't see, with a couple of examples, of course, you don't see too many people coming into politics after they've served a lengthy career doing something else, because it's expected that you have some experience.
So just briefly, Lincoln is obviously huge. There's been a lot of ink spilled about Lincoln. I think people have written books on every single aspect of the guy's life from birth till death and after. I guess here, obviously I was expecting him to be in the book, but again, it seems one of those things where, to me, it seemed like his death and loss obviously it was the first assassination, one of four, hopefully only four. But maybe that's just how, I'm sure other people had sent their condolences and stuff, but Lincoln dying felt more of because of the way he died. And there's kind of these biblical overtures, dying on Good Friday, and, it's kind of that stuff. But it felt Lincoln, death and how he died felt more global. Is that something that we can say? Yeah, I'm sure other heads of state or whatever from other countries would send their condolences if someone dies, but this was like a big deal. Like, you were getting other people from other countries. Is that kind of like he just, like, Lincoln became, because it was an assassination and that's how he died, that he just, in a way that kind of contributes to his, semi-deification of how people view him, as sorts of this kind of almost holy figure that was, sacrificed. It's a lot of biblical stuff there, but I don't know. What do you make of his whole kind of, dying? And there was the immediacy of the legacy, and then still to this day, people, absolutely lionize him. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of elements that contribute to this outcome. One, as you said, it was the way in which he died. It's hard for us because there have been several assassinations. It was actually fairly unusual in American history that there hadn't been until that point, because political violence is a part of the human condition, but there hadn't been. And so it was shocking in a way that is impossible for us to explain now, because we've seen it happen. Whenever anything happens for the first time, the level of shock and surprise is hard to describe. When it happened, the fact that it was almost at the end of the war, and there was this glorious outcome, and sort of riding this high, at least in the North, riding this high to success, and then the just like shocking turn of events. So I think that part of it was a huge piece. The fact that people felt robbed, that he wasn't there to see it to the end, and what might have happened had he stayed. Of course, the biblical overtones that you mentioned, I think really can't be understated, because it was a nation that was predominantly Christian in some form at that time, and a more religious nation. So those elements were not missed by anybody. And then, of course, there was this sense, and I think correctly, that he died in service to the cause. So John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln because of what he had been leading the nation towards. It was an attempt to stall the Union victory. And so it was very much a sense that he sort of died for the nation. And that is not the only time that's happened, I suppose, but it's certainly one of the few in the presidency. And so it's just such a unique situation, and one that really hasn't been totally replicated in the same way. And so as a result, I think the American people were just flabbergasted that this could happen. And I think that was shared across the globe. And now when a president dies, usually heads of state send condolences. That's sort of standard practice. But that was a new thing. It was a new thing for sure. Although, well, it was mostly new. There were commemorations and observances of Washington's death in Europe when he died. Napoleon did a whole thing before the peace envoys arrived in 1799 in Paris. But for the most part, Lincoln sort of started that process.
Yeah. And of course, there are two presidents after him that are assassinated, McKinley and Garfield, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
So three, actually, technically, including Kennedy.
Yeah, and Kennedy as well, the third. But I was saying two out before. They weren't mentioned in the book, but the next president that's mentioned, I believe.
Yes.
One of the next is Theodore Roosevelt. And I know Matt wrote this chapter, right? I think Matt wrote this chapter.
He did, yeah. I'm sorry that he's not here to talk to us about it, because that was his chapter.
That's quite all right. He can listen back to this and send me a nice email if I get it all wrong. But I was curious. I was curious about the emphasis on this chapter, because obviously Teddy had he's an imperfect person, obviously, and I know Matt's been doing research on Roosevelt, so again he probably is close to this stuff. But the chapter focuses on some of the emphasis of race, and I think it talks about taking the statue down outside of one of the buildings,
the Museum of Natural History.
Yeah, and I was curious about. There's so many things to be said about Roosevelt, and kind of what you had said in the beginning is, or at some point, that a lot of the times when we like certain people, we just always kind of do like a, not a puff piece, but it's just like, oh, they're great. Look at all these things. And that's fair. That's fair to do somewhat, but to also have a critical lens. So I don't think that that's wrong, but I was just curious why, I guess, this emphasis on some of the race issues and with Teddy Roosevelt in particular, also considering the time and where things were in the country and things like that. So I don't know if you know anything about, that chapter and why some of the emphasis or things like that.
Yeah, well, I think there are probably two factors that shaped how Matt wrote this chapter, although sort of loath to speak for him, but I think based on our conversations, I think there are two factors that shaped how Matthew wrote it. And so I think the first is when we started pulling together the volumes. So we started pulling this together in 2019. And then it was sort of delayed by the pandemic and everything that happened in that summer in terms of our nation's sort of collective racial reckoning and rethinking of how we want to commemorate people and what statues we want to have. And as this was all happening, the museum did decide to take down the statue of Theodore Roosevelt that was sitting outside in front of it, with the support of the Roosevelt descendants and family. And it is now going to a museum, or I think the president, maybe the new library in North Dakota, where it will hopefully be, I think, addressed in context with a broader look at his legacy. So I think that was piece number one, is the timing, which is why history should constantly be written and rewritten, because everyone has a different angle to view things based on what they are experiencing. And I think that that's right and proper. The second piece of it, I think, is we really, for the most part, don't actually talk about the president's presidencies. So we don't actually really talk all that much about what they do in office. There are a couple of exceptions, of course, but really this book starts with the death of whoever it is. And so then it's about, how does the family respond? How do the supporters or the detractors respond to the situation, try and shape a legacy? And how does the legacy change over time? And Roosevelt, I think, is one of the examples of how, not that the good things should ever be erased, and there are a lot of extraordinary things that he did, but his legacy, I think, has become more complicated because of the views he had about racial hierarchies and Native Americans and sometimes his glorification of war earlier on in his life, less so towards the end. And so I think that when we're talking about legacy, especially with Roosevelt in particular, it's hard not to talk about those issues, because his legacy is one that has sort of undergone some complexity. And that's not just, I think if we were writing a chapter about the presidency, it would probably look pretty different than if we were writing it about the legacy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And I do think, kind of to the first point, it is good to we have to look at things obviously within their time and the context, but also as we move through time and we start to look at things from where we're at, in 10, 15 years, that might look different. And that's okay. I think that's right. But it was really interesting, because it was like, I think it's good to push ourselves or to challenge ourselves to even the people that we like or we care about, to say, they weren't perfect. And people do this, I think, in Washington and Lincoln as well, all the people that everyone, kind of adores. It's like, yeah, but they weren't perfect either, and they get it wrong. And we have to be, critical and things like that, which I think is all appropriate. You mentioned FDR earlier, and I think one of the things I was reading this chapter was, I think people don't really get now how tremendous FDR was for his current generation and even the subsequent generations, and how massive that loss was for his death. A quick story. A long time ago, when I was first started to kind of work in my profession, I worked in a assisted living home. So this was in the, I'm showing my age here, in the early 2000s. When I worked there, a lot of these folks had memory issues, Alzheimer's, dementia. And it would be interesting because you would do all these types of things and people's long-term memory kind of stays. And many people there were in their 80s. And they remembered FDR. And they would talk
that's so cool.
they might have been quite young, but they would talk glowingly about FDR. I mean, in the early 2000s, that wasn't that long ago. I guess it would have at that time been 60 years ago. Yeah. So, that was, I kind of hearing those, people tell stories about, on the radio and the address and Pearl Harbor and all these things. It's like for folks at that time and afterwards, him gone was like, just, absolutely just this huge break in society in 44, 45, whatever it was. And I just, we haven't really, I guess Kennedy's somewhat like that, but to your point, FDR was president for 12 years. I mean, and he just won re-election for you, was going to be 16. And so it's, I don't know, it's just tremendous. And so I guess in talking about that, what was his loss like in mourning his death, and after the war and right at the end, all these things, I guess we just don't have anything to compare to that. So I guess when people read it, it might be hard to kind of get why his loss was such a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think part of it is he had been in office for so long, of course, but then also what the country had endured during those 12 years. So he came in during the Great Depression, and there was all of the New Deal programming, and then World War II. And so there's a lot of lives lived in that period of time. Yeah. And also a pretty significant change in the way the country was. So the New Deal state was a creation of FDR. So the concept of Social Security or Medicare or all of these programs to try and put people back to work, all of the legislation to try and preserve the banking system, all of that had been done during his presidency. And then there's Pearl Harbor, and then there's the ramp up to World War II and the complete mobilization of the entire nation to fight the war. And so the world had completely changed during his administration. And it was impossible sort of to imagine a pre-FDR world. He also was unique in that he had a special way of speaking to the American people that made them feel like he knew them and understood them, but was listening to them. Yeah. And both he and Eleanor did together. It was very much a partnership and a project that they both embraced. But he was the first president to do the fireside chats. Yeah. And so in moments of crisis, he spoke directly to them in their homes in a way that kind of like, think about today. I mean, you guys are all obviously listen to podcasts. So you think about how someone is, in your head, and you feel like you know that person and that you have a relationship with them, even if you've never met them in person. Radio was similar in the 1930s and 1940s because you usually had a radio at home and you'd sit around it and listen to it. And so there was a personal connection. There was sort of the temporal connection. And then I think there was sort of a sense, again, not unlike Lincoln, of being robbed, that he got so close to the end of the war and just couldn't quite get to the end. And so there was a sadness that he didn't see it through, this project that he had really spearheaded, and a sadness that the country didn't have his wisdom and benefit at the end of the war as well.
Yeah, it always would have been interesting to see what his, second Bill of Rights, which was, basically the closest thing we get to a kind of really large social kind of, a safety net. It was right there, and he had the full 4 years to try and get a lot of that done, and, it never happened. And, Truman after him, did.
Well, and I always wonder, he was trying really hard to hold the alliance together between Great Britain and the Soviet Union and the United States, and how might his relationship with Stalin have changed the post-war landscape? Not that Stalin was completely trusting of FDR. Stalin wasn't completely trusting of anybody, but he knew FDR at least better than he knew Truman. And so I think that relationship might have altered things a bit. I'm not a Soviet expert, but I think it at least would have done something. And so it's, interesting to think about how that might have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the last few here is obviously Kennedy's a big one. Again, it was it's November 22nd, 63, he's assassinated. There's been, again, lots of ink spilled on just the assassination, and obviously conspiracies and things like that. I guess in the chapter, I was really surprised by, I wasn't I know everyone loves him, like people at the time and even still. And obviously there's been ups and downs of his legacy and stuff. And my personal, again, as a non-historian, I just don't think it's fair to judge somebody's legacy on like 1,000 days in office. Like, it just doesn't feel fair. It wasn't enough to even do stuff. But the chapter was interesting because it just showed that different communities really felt a huge loss. So it was a generational thing, but also, various communities. I think it was, Black folks and white folks and Latin folks and immigrants. And I just didn't really kind of get I've never really heard it described that way. You just hear generationally it was a big loss, but I guess talking about how different communities or groups of folks really felt it. I guess what was, in putting that in here and editing it, what was, I guess, kind of your thoughts on, like, we hear a lot about the generational loss, but what is it else about different communities really being impacted by Kennedy's death?
Yeah, so Sharon Conrad wrote this chapter, and I really wanted to include this information because Kennedy is often described, at least colloquially, as, this big civil rights president. Mm-hmm. In reality, everything happens during LBJ's presidency. All of the big landmark legislation happens after Kennedy died. And partly that's because LBJ was able to leverage the sentiment after Kennedy's death and sort of say that they were going to do it in honor of him. But it also was really a product of LBJ's masterful domination of Congress.
Oh, yes.
So for me personally, I've always been annoyed when people talk about Kennedy as this great civil rights president. And I'm like, why? Mm-hmm. Where is the proof? Like, what is the reason that people think this? And so I was so interested to read that Sharon talks about how, for a lot of African Americans, Kennedy was the first president to say anything and to talk about this issue. And we, today we kind of say, well, talk is cheap and action is really what matters. And what she said is that for a lot of people, the symbolism, the huge moment, the turning point of actually having that conversation was important and mattered and was something they remembered. And there was a sense that even if, maybe some of the historical record doesn't back this up, there was a sense that he was a martyr for the cause, that he was killed because of the civil rights issue. And so he died for them, not unlike Lincoln, died for this cause. And so I think what's so beneficial about this chapter is it explores how certain people or how certain communities connect to figures in ways that maybe wouldn't be intuitive to others, and then remember them and how they remember them and how they become these hugely important figures in culture and in the material culture that people surround themselves in and the stories they pass down.
Yeah, it's super interesting with Kennedy, and again, just kind of that zooming in and zooming out, which is kind of what the chapter does, is this idea of the impact of right when it happened, and even the ripple effects of that, decades later. Obviously, we have Reagan, who had Alzheimer's, probably the last year or two of his presidency. I think some people have speculated. I don't know if anyone has come out and said that officially or whatever, and he lived for a long time afterwards. But he lived for a long time, with a debilitating illness. How much do you think that impacted? I mean, people loved Reagan at the time. Well, it's mixed, I guess, in certain years and things like that. But people, do you feel like his Alzheimer's and living with it for 2004, so I guess almost 20 years, like 14 years, whatever that is, did that have an impact on how people have viewed Reagan? Like, it's like just seeing him kind of suffer through that and not remembering all these things. Like, did that impact some of those things? And then when he finally was gone, it was really wow, he suffered a lot in all these things, and impacting how long he was president, 8 years, and his vice president for 4 years after. I mean, I don't know. What do you think about how his post presidency impact and then his eventual death impacted how people have viewed him?
Yeah, I think that it really did have a big impact in sort of a counterintuitive way. So you would sort of expect that because he was ill for a really long time, that the death wouldn't be as much of a surprise, or maybe wouldn't be quite as sad, because people could be prepared for it or could expect it, or had sort of made their own internal goodbyes ahead of time because he was maybe no longer able to recognize people. But I think in some ways it almost had the reverse, that people felt like he had suffered, or, it was really sad. It was humanizing. It's devastating to see anyone robbed of their faculties, their memories, the things that made them unique and special. And that was especially true for Reagan, who was such a personable individual and who had the ability to communicate really effectively and was warm and engaging. And so I think that the loss of him and the way that happened and the personalness of his funeral and the mourning around it, because of his really remarkable marriage with Nancy Reagan, especially, it felt really intimate, even though it was this giant national experience. I think people felt like they lost someone that they loved, and they knew what that personal grief felt like. I think also perhaps because he didn't have much of a public post-presidency, people didn't really have anything additional to add to that legacy. And so, with Carter, it's really changed how people think about him, because he's done all these extraordinary things post-presidency. Well, with Reagan, it kind of stops because he really was pretty private. And so, and this was partly intentional. This was, a choice by his family to really emphasize a lot of the positive things of his legacy. But I think the ceremonies really had a sense of sort of like reflecting on a sunnier time, on a time when the U.S. was at the apex of its global power. And, it was a moment in the sun, and he was a happy warrior. And it just it's like the memories just kind of stop because he then went away. And so I do think it absolutely changed how people mourned, how people reflected and experienced that particular death.
I guess the last question is, we've mentioned, Bush 41 at the beginning as the most recent. And it seems that, that's sort of kind of, again, with exceptions, as we mentioned with Carter and stuff, but a sort of type of template of how we currently do funerals for presidents. Where do you think our understanding of the death and funerals and the whole proceeding for presidents, where does that go, I guess, in the future? How do you see it evolving? And how does, in those moments when that happens, how do we continue to have this kind of idea of reflections and legacy right afterwards, and how that continues to evolve?
Well, historians are notoriously terrible future predictors, so I would not put money on what I'm about to say happening. But I think that maybe less with Carter, because he has been a post-president for so long. But as we get into the next several passings, I think that it's going to be a test, because in the past, for the most part, it has been a fairly bipartisan process. Even people like Nixon, Democrats came out of the woodwork to sort of talk about some of the good things he had done post-presidency, to counsel and advise presidents behind the scenes, and they were sort of willing to hold their tongue. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to happen in our political climate at the moment. I don't see a whole lot of bipartisan, obviously, hopefully, knock on wood, we're a long ways away from President Obama no longer being with us. But when that happens, I don't know, depending on how the political system goes, I don't know if there would be a bipartisan reflection, which I think is a shame, because with, I think, few exceptions, most presidents have at least some things to contribute, or at the very least, they have continued the institutions, with a couple of exceptions. And so I think that there's always something decent to say about someone. And it's not that you should obscure the bad things, but I think that there should be at least a bipartisan recognition of, this person served in office, they played a role, we will pay respects to at least their time in office. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to hold. So I have no idea what that will look like going forward. And I don't think it's bad to rethink how we do these things. I'm not sure the way we've done them is always right, but I don't know that bloody partisan response is where we want to go. So I hope that we can be a little bit more thoughtful about it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Well, the book is called Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, edited by yourself and Matthew Costello. Where can people find the book, and where can people find the both of you?
Well, people, if they're interested, can find the book wherever you buy books. If you would like to receive 30% off, you can use the code 10 Mourning. So the number 10, 10 Mourning, like the funeral, not the time of day, at the University of Virginia Press website. And maybe we can share a link to that. Mm-hmm. So if people are interested, it's also available on Amazon and anywhere else you are interested in finding those things. Matthew is on Twitter. I don't remember his handle off the top of my head, but it's Matthew Costello. Mm-hmm. I am on social media at LM Chervinsky or L Chervinsky on everything other than Twitter. My website is lindsaychervinsky.com, and a lot of Matt's work can be found at the White House Historical Association website.
Very nice. Yeah, I'll post all the links there. I'm sad that Matt couldn't get here because of all the technical issues. That's okay though. We were thinking about him the whole time, and of course, it's always lovely to talk to you, Lindsay. You're always so wonderful and generous and very, very brilliant with all of your thoughts, and I really, really enjoy it. And so I'm looking forward to all of the other things you have coming up. So,
well, thank you so much for having me back. I really appreciate it, and yes, I will tell Matt we missed him and look forward to talking more in the future.
Yes, of course.